was more than 200 years old and works as well today as when it was created.
It has 10 parts that make a powerful whole and empowers each of us every day.
Do you know what it is? Hi, I'm Sid, and welcome to Democracy Rules. If you guessed the Bill of Rights, you are absolutely right. After the Constitution, the Bill of Rights is probably the most important document of our United States. But what do you know about the Bill of Rights and what it actually means to you and me? Let's see what some of you think.
Hi, I'm Shabela. I'm out here to find out what you know about the Bill of Rights. Excuse me, do you know what the Bill of Rights is?
Yeah, the Bill of Rights were created to improve the Constitution, give more rights to the people.
To add some rights to the citizens of what the Constitution probably didn't make before.
Bill of Rights is a document that was written in the 1700s, and it's part of the Constitution, and it states our rights as individuals in this country.
Well, it sounds like some of us know something about the Bill of Rights, but we should all probably know more. Why? Let's go to our resident expert, Senator Les Miller. Senator?
Thanks, Sid. With me today to discuss the Bill of Rights is Dr. Lawrence Morehouse, professor at the University of South Florida. Dr. Morehouse, thank you for being with us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure to be here.
Why should the youth of America care about the Bill of Rights?
I think first and foremost, they must understand that America has a system based upon democracy. And the Bill of Rights was added to the American Constitution to ensure that democracy works. And more specifically, students should understand that the Bill of Rights is really designed to protect their liberties and their freedoms. For example, their ability to access the internet, to communicate with each other, to a large extent is protected by the First Amendment because the First Amendment provides for freedom of speech. It also gives them the ability to practice their religions of their choice. It also protects for freedom of religion. And perhaps one thing that I think that students should always be concerned with is the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment in the U.S. Constitution prohibits the state from engaging in search and seizures without having a warrant from a neutral magistrate. So whenever a student is driving a car that can be pulled over by the police, they need to know then what the scope of these rights are. And of course, the Fifth Amendment, perhaps maybe one of the most important amendments that we have in the Bill of Rights, that amendment has a due process clause. And what that does, it guarantees you a right to a trial by jury in the event that for some reason you're arrested. We also have a writ of habeas corpus, which is really not in the Bill of Rights, but that right to some extent is also protected because of the rights which are specified in the Bill of Rights. I remember a famous case that was adjudicated here in Florida called Gideon versus Wainwright. Gideon was accused of robbing a pool hall. When Gideon was arrested, he was taken to court. There was an arraignment held, and at that time he requested that the court appoint him an attorney. He said that he was poor, he didn't have enough money to retain an attorney, and the court refused. He was able to rely upon the due process clause and the Sixth Amendment right to counsel guaranteed by the Bill of Rights, and ultimately he did manage to get the state to give him an attorney to defend himself. Later on, he was acquitted of having committed any crimes. So I think that any person, regardless of whether or not they're a student in a school system or an adult, should thank the Bill of Rights for being available to them to ensure that they have freedom and justice in America.
Vitally important, vitally important. Perhaps the most basic right we have is the freedom of speech, which you touched on earlier. Are there times that this causes problems in this country?
The First Amendment right, I don't believe that we can maintain a democratic state without having freedom of speech. To me, it's one of the most important amendments in the Bill of Rights. And I think because of its importance is probably why it's listed first, the First Amendment listed in the U.S. Constitution as far as being a part of the Bill of Rights. Free speech can be very complex in that the language is not entirely clear in the First Amendment. We know that generally the language states that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, but it protects your right to have free press. We know that free press is essential. We cannot conduct elections unless we have free press. It protects your right to engage in protest. Sometimes we disagree with what government does, and government cannot prevent us from disagreeing publicly. That is so critically important, I think. Even if we think about, for example, the Vietnam War, I think that the reason that ultimately America decides to bring its troops home from the Vietnam War is probably because of public protest over long involvement in that war without ever having declared that was in fact a declared war. Students, when the First Amendment right is connected to the internet, we know that there are a lot of problems with the internet, especially trying to perhaps regulate and control what we have access to. But I think what the internet has done, that new technology has brought people together from across the world. When we think also about television and radio, the First Amendment guarantees that you have a right to have access to television. We know that there have been some efforts to screen and to limit what one can have exposure to. But because of the First Amendment, you can just about view anything that you want on television. And I think a good part of that regulation, in part, has been at least to rate movies, so that parents will know what kind of movies they want to have their students, at least their kids, to view, so that they can screen access to that. But I believe that because of the First Amendment, we're able to enjoy a great deal of freedom when it comes to speech. And as I said earlier, in the absence of that particular right, there's no way that you can maintain a democratic state. If you think about tyranny, one of the basic reasons why we decided to include the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights is because of the tyranny that America experienced under the British government. And even contemporaneously, one of the first things that a tyrannical government would do is suppress speech. Realizing that you cannot have rebellion, you cannot actually oppose anything that government does without having some speech available to you. And so we need to continue to have access to that. I believe that we can only make intelligent decisions about politicians who are running for office, who are trying to become president of the United States, who are trying to run for members of the state legislature, for members of Congress, unless we have access to information that's made available to us from a variety of different sources. So speech is indeed absolutely essential.
Perhaps the best way to measure the importance of the Bill of Rights is to imagine living without the Bill of Rights. Sid, why don't you give us a quick history lesson on what led us up to the Bill of Rights?
Thanks, Senator. The Bill of Rights is very important for how we live today, but it didn't come about easily. We looked at what came before the Bill of Rights in another episode, but just to make sure we're all up to speed, let's do 60 seconds of history.
England's Magna Carta in 1215 and the English Bill of Rights in 1688 were early steps towards democracy, but it wasn't enough for some. These dissenters left England for the New World to establish colonies, but soon wanted total freedom from England. The Revolutionary War began in 1775, and in 1776, through the Declaration of Independence, the colonies proclaimed their freedom and separation from England. After declaring their independence, the colonies realized they needed something to band them together. They created the Articles of Confederation in 1777, which created a weak and ineffectual government, even though it did bring an end to the Revolutionary War. It was clear that the independent states needed a structured government to move forward. In 1787, after months of debate and compromise, the Constitution was created as the supreme law of the land and established the form of government that we still have today.
Okay, now we can get back to the Bill of Rights. The need for the Bill of Rights was very apparent during the ratification of the Constitution. Most states agreed with what it said, but there was lots of controversy about what it didn't say. The big issue was that it didn't include protection of civil liberties, the very liberties that early settlers had fought for and died to gain. Many supported the Constitution if a Bill of Rights would follow, but Virginia Delegate George Mason refused to sign, offering his Virginia Bill of Rights as a template. Less than 3 years later, 10 amendments to protect personal rights and freedoms were ratified at one time. James Madison officially submitted the amendments, but George Mason is remembered as the father of the Bill of Rights.
The framers of the Bill of Rights did not purport to create rights. Rather, they designed the Bill of Rights to prohibit our government from infringing rights and liberties presumed to be pre-existing.
Did you know there are several websites dedicated to the Bill of Rights? Right now, I'm at billofrights.com, but here are some other good sites for Bill of Rights information. Okay, let's have a look at the individual amendments in the Bill of Rights. Here's Amendment 1.
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peacefully to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances.
Wow, this one amendment gives us 5 important freedoms: the freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly, and petition. Let's go to Senator Miller for a look at the power of Amendment 1. Senator?
Shavela, the First Amendment may be the single most important part of the Constitution. Dr. Morehouse, how does that relate to young people today?
It's no doubt that students' ability to exercise free speech is no doubt impacted by the First Amendment in a number of significant ways. There have been efforts in the past to regulate the kind of books that they can have access, that they can read. The First Amendment nearly prohibits such regulation in that so they can get access to that kind of literature. There have been a few cases that have gone to the Supreme Court in response to efforts of school systems to regulate student newspapers. Mm-hmm. Now, what has been done in that regard is that the courts have given principals of schools a little more latitude in restraining some of that free speech there, but we know that at a minimum students are allowed to publish their own newspapers. Students are allowed to engage in protests if they like. I can remember when I was in graduate school in New York and Cornell, when students wanted to protest American involvement in the war, there was nothing the university could do to stop them from engaging in that protest. And I believe that perhaps maybe some of the fundamental changes that we've had in part have come about as a result of student protests exercising their First Amendment right. MTV, some of the broadcasts that you see on MTV, they have been an effort to restrain or limit that broadcast substantially, but the First Amendment has prevented that limitation from occurring. So much of the right that students enjoy when it comes to reading newspapers, watching television, being able even to have access to certain types of video games, have been protected by the First Amendment. So they certainly should have some concern for that right.
What happens when people overstep those rights?
Well, one thing that I think that we all must know, and certainly students must know this, is that while the Bill of Rights is a great protector of freedoms, it doesn't guarantee you an absolute right. That is, the First Amendment can be restrained. We certainly have, and our Constitution has some concerns with using speech in a way that it damages someone else's right, where it causes harm not only to individuals but also causes harm to government. Then, of course, the state can step in and really limit that speech. They can also engage in prior restraint under those circumstances, and certainly they can punish you after the fact, mm-hmm. if in fact the speech that you engage in does result in damaging someone. For example, you do not have a right to slander someone. You don't have a right to say things on the radio, to make speeches on television, or to publish articles and books that essentially are telling lies about someone and thus damage their reputation. So you can be sued for those kinds of statements. You don't have a right to libel someone, that is, to write stories or articles in a newspaper that are also false. If an individual can prove that those things are false and that they're published with malicious intent, then you may be held liable for that. And so that's where the state is going to draw the line. That's where the courts have allowed the state to draw the line.
There's so many issues that we're talking about the Amendment 1. We're going to have to come back and talk about a few more as we move on. So we want to just put a pin in it right there and talk about those in a few minutes.
Thank you.
Shavela, what's next?
Thanks, Senator. Let's keep going. Amendment 2 and 3 are straightforward. 2 gives people the right to bear arms, and 3 prevents citizens from being forced to house soldiers.
In an attempt to exercise more control over the colonists, Britain passed the Quartering Act of 1765, which ordered them to house and feed British soldiers. And that's a fact.
Okay, Amendments 4 through 8 all deal with our rights if the authorities believe we have broken the law. Amendment 4 prohibits unreasonable search and seizure and requires a warrant for any search. Amendment 5 requires a grand jury to accuse someone for a serious crime. It gives an accused person the right to remain silent and a guarantee of due process of law. It protects individuals from being tried twice for the same crime, which is called double jeopardy, and it prevents private property from being taken for public use without fair compensation. Amendment 6 guarantees an accused person the right to a speedy and public trial by jury, plus some basic rights regarding a trial.
What could happen if Amendment 5 didn't exist?
Amendments 7, 8, and 9 are short, but they're still important. Amendment 7 preserves the right of trial by jury in suits of common law. 8 prohibits excessive bail or fines as well as cruel and unusual punishment. 9 states that a person's rights are not limited to those outlined in the Constitution. And Amendment 10 gives all powers not delegated in the Constitution to the states and/or the people.
Don't interfere with anything in the Constitution. That must be maintained, for it is the only safeguard of our liberties.
Now, I know you're thinking, okay, it's good we've got rights, but why do I have to think about them? Well, what do you think our lives would be like without these rights? Let's go to Senator Miller for a perspective on that. Senator?
Said, our lives could be very different without the Bill of Rights. Dr. Morehouse, if we didn't have the rights guaranteed, what might happen?
Well, I think it's clear that the Bill of Rights were added to the Constitution out of fear of government repression and government tyranny. If you imagine for the moment that prior to the American Revolution, what precipitated the American Revolutions were abuses on the colonies by the British government. And if we look at the specific amendments in the Bill of Rights, we know that that government essentially denied all the rights that are expressed there. The Bill of Rights really is a response to that type of oppression that we experience from the British government. For example, the British government at soldiers' quarters, put soldiers in people's homes prior to the introduction of the Bill of Rights. They would go in and seize their property, their personal effects, and they never really got those things returned to them. People were put in jail without having the ability to confront a witness against them. They were tortured. When you take a look at the Fifth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment prohibits a person from engaging in self-incrimination. Well, self-incrimination only occurs when you're tortured. And so individuals were tortured, and there were no real consequences from our government from that. And it is really naive to believe that if these rights were not there today, that somehow these same abuses would not occur contemporaneously, because they have occurred contemporaneously. For example, the young defendant in New York City who was beaten brutally by police officers while he was incarcerated in a police station in New York City here recently, his right ultimately was protected because of the Fifth Amendment right. We know that ultimately the police officers were punished because of their violation of his Fifth Amendment right. Think about Miranda. I think every student probably has heard of Miranda versus Arizona, where before, when a police officer engages in an interrogation, they have to Mirandize you. If we think about the evolution of those particular set of requirements, those requirements were created by the courts because of an abuse on the part of the state. So they are there, they're emanated from an interpretation of the due process requirement in the Fifth Amendment, saying to the state that you cannot force a person to incriminate against himself. I remember one of the first cases that I read involving the due process concept in the Fifth Amendment, where a guy had been accused of raping a lady. They had no real evidence that in fact he had committed that rape. And early one morning the police officers came knocking on his door and trying to get him to confess to having committed that crime. So he refused to confess, so they dragged him from his house, put a rope around his neck, hung him from a tree, and as he's about to breathe his last breath of air, he confessed to having committed that crime. Only when he finally got to trial and indicated to the judge that he did not commit the crime, he only admitted to having done that crime because of he thought he would lose his life if he didn't say, yes, I committed the crime. And ultimately, the court said that that type of interrogation is unconstitutional. This sort of happened contemporaneously in the United States. So the Bill of Rights then were brought into play to prevent these types of interrogations from taking place.
Even with the Bill of Rights, do we have to be concerned about our constitutional rights?
There's no doubt about that. I think that when you look at the Bill of Rights, a substantial portion of the language in the Bill of Rights is substantially ambiguous. Even if you think about due process itself, there's no clear definition of what that means. And what happens is that the meaning of a term takes on, it really becomes what the court said it is. When a case goes to the court, the judge then has to decide, what does a due process concept really requires. And for a long, long time, Miranda warnings, for example, as I mentioned earlier, were not required. Before that time, then it means that interrogations could take place, and a person could be damaged as a result of that interrogation. But if the judge did not see that as being a violation of that Fifth Amendment right, then that type of behavior then was not stopped by the state. So it's not until courts decides that they want to prevent the behavior that the behavior will cease. So the meaning given to the Bill of Rights will vacillate depending upon who's making the interpretation. First Amendment freedoms, for example, have been restrained throughout the years for a variety of different reasons. We know now, however, that the courts have been much more liberal in trying to give meaning to the First Amendment freedom. So we've literally seen an expansion of that right over the last 20 years compared to what it was many, many years ago. We also know that, take for example, some of the issues related to school segregation. School segregation in the United States was deemed to be legal, not illegal in the United States, for at least over 60 years since the inception of the American Constitution. But we know that at least in 1954, Brown decides that segregation is illegal in the United States. And the Constitution itself was not rewritten, the Bill of Rights was not rewritten in this, but it was a new interpretation by a new set of justices that brought with it a different meaning of the Bill of Rights and what they mean. So yes, contemporaneously, we do have to be concerned with how the Bill of Rights is applied. Anytime the language is indeed ambiguous, we can't anticipate inconsistent interpretation and application of those rules.
It's important not to take our rights for granted.
Thanks, Senator. You've probably heard there's no such thing as a free lunch. Well, that's true of our rights too. With rights come responsibility and accountability. In order for every citizen to enjoy these rights, there are certain laws and rules that all citizens have to respect and support. So, let's look at how the Bill of Rights work in real life.
Because of freedom of speech, we can freely express our opinions verbally or in writing, even if our views are unpopular. Then why can't you wear a t-shirt to school with an obscenity on it? Because some forms of expression are not protected, such as libel, slander, and obscene language or printed words. We are free to speak, but we can be held responsible for what we say.
Libel, false and malicious use of printed words. Slander, false and malicious use of spoken words.
With the freedom to assemble, we can meet together to express our views on public issues, but we can't turn those meetings into riots.
We can present our views through petitions, letters, parades, or other demonstrations as long as it's peaceable.
Our liberty depends on the freedom of the press, and that cannot be limited without being lost.
Freedom of the press. We've all heard of that. It's vital in a democratic society. All of the media is free to deliver information of public interest without censorship. But there are rules governing the press too, such as libel or slander.
One sign of the importance of a free press is that when anti-democratic forces take over a country, their first act is often to muzzle the press. And that is a fact.
Okay, what rights do you have if you're accused of a crime? Well, generally, authorities can't come barging into your home or search your car without a search warrant, although there are some circumstances where they can. To get a search warrant, authorities must go to a judge who decides if a search is reasonable. I'll bet we've all heard someone being read their rights on TV shows. You have the right to remain silent. If you give up the right to remain silent, anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law, and so forth. These are called Miranda Rights, named after a mentally handicapped man who was arrested and convicted of a crime without ever knowing his rights. The Miranda rule requires that arresting authorities inform suspects of these rights.
Here's another one. You know how some people have to move out of their homes for the expansion of roadways? Well, thanks to the Bill of Rights, private property is protected and governments have to buy the land at a fair market value.
But if those people refuse to sell their property, the government can exercise eminent domain, which is its power to take property for a good public use. The property owner would be forced to sell, but they would be paid a fair market value.
Wow, that's a long-winded explanation. But as citizens, we need to understand our rights. Let's go back to Senator Miller for a look at what we can do as citizens to preserve those rights. Senator?
Thanks, Sid. Dr. Morehouse, what can students do to keep government of, for, and by the people?
I think first and foremost, I believe that they must have a fundamental respect for the rule of law. Second, I believe that they must also be willing to participate in a democratic process. As you know, the studies have shown that students tend not to vote, especially at a very young age. So whenever that opportunity is made available to them, then they certainly should exercise that right. They certainly should be mindful of who we tend to elect and send to office. We certainly want to send people to public office that do have a respect for those basic values that we see pronounced in the American Constitution. Thirdly, students should be willing to learn as much as they possibly can about some of the contemporary issues that we're faced with, and to be able to play a role in trying to help to solve those problems. For example, we know that we have been involved in the war in the Middle East now for at least 4 or 5 years, and as a result of that, we've had some prisoners of war that were taken who are in Guantanamo Bay. They need to pay attention to these kinds of conflicts. I think also they need to play a role in trying to make certain that government holds up to its obligations not to take America to war when it's not necessary for us to take them to war. I believe that democracy only works because people make it work. Throughout history, we know that there are a number of countries that have great constitutions, they have great bodies of laws, but they don't adhere to those regulations. And because they do not adhere to those regulations, then they have a constant state of turmoil. I believe that America has managed to sort of distinguish itself, at least in that part, because Americans do tend to say to our government that when they think the government is misbehaving, is not fair, that they do tend to hold them to a very high standard, and they do believe in the Bill of Rights and those other laws that are part of the American Constitution.
We're out of time. You've been great. Thank you for being here, Dr. Morehouse. We appreciate it so very, very much.
My pleasure being here.
Sid, Shavilla, back to you.
Thanks, Senator. Well, that's the Bill of Rights in a nutshell. 10 powerful statements of freedom that have guided the United States for more than 200 years.
Let's be sure they're around for another 200, because democracy rules, and you rule in a democracy. See you next time.
Democracy rules!